The rooftop of the Sterling Grand was a cathedral of glass and ego, vibrated with a low hum of people who owned the world. At the center of the orbit stood Adrian Vale, the oracle of logistics, looking every bit the savior of Silicon Valley in a custom Italian suit that cost more than his first car. He was mid-laugh, his arm draped possessively over Camille Hart. Camille, in shimmering designer white, was the perfect crown for his success, a living trophy to prove he'd moved on from the struggling years. "To the future," Adrian toasted, his hazel eyes scanning the room for cameras. "To the Series C, and to the man who makes it possible, Victor Sterling." The room raised their glasses, but the toast died in their throats. The elevator doors slid open, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Zara Knight didn't enter with a shout. She entered with the silence of a predator. She was a vision of deep caramel skin and midnight silk, her natural curls framed by the city lights behind her. She looked nothing like the distraught ex-wife Adrian had described to his board. She looked like the person who had written the code. They were all there to celebrate. The thin gold bracelet on her wrist, a relic of the warehouse days, glinted like a blade. Adrian's smile didn't just fade. It curdled. He felt Camille's grip tighten on his bicep, her blue eyes darting between him and the woman in black. "Adrian," Camille whispered, her voice trembling with the first seed of doubt. "Who is that?" "Nobody," Adrian hissed, though his heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "Just a ghost from the startup phase. She's probably here for a handout." He began to move toward her, preparing a polite, crushing dismissal to usher her back to the elevator. He had the narrative ready. Poor Zara. She just couldn't handle the scale of my genius. But he was intercepted. Victor Sterling, the billionaire shark who had spent the last hour ignoring every politician in the room, cut across the floor. He didn't just walk. He cleared a path. He bypassed Adrian entirely, his steel-gray eyes fixed solely on Zara. In front of the press, the board, and a stunned Camille, the most powerful investor in the country took Zara's hand and pressed a slow, respectful kiss to her knuckles. "You're late, Zara," Victor said, his voice carrying through the sudden, suffocating silence. "I told the board I wouldn't sign the $65 million check until the true architect of the engine arrived." The glass in Adrian's hand didn't just tremble, it shattered. The warehouse in the industrial district of Oakland didn't just smell of burnt coffee and ozone. It smelled of a dream being ground into dust by 20-hour workdays. It was 3 a.m., and the only light in the cavernous space came from the flickering blue glow of 4 mismatched monitors and a single string of Edison bulbs Zara had hung to make the concrete feel less like a tomb. Zara sat hunched over a keyboard, her fingers moving with a rhythmic, percussive speed. Her natural curls were pulled back into a messy, frustrated bun. Her eyes, dark, sharp, and bloodshot, were fixed on a cascading waterfall of logic. This was the adaptive flow engine. It wasn't just code. It was a living, breathing map of human chaos, a way to predict the needs of a city before the city even knew it was hungry. A few feet away, Adrian Vale lay sprawled on a pile of discarded North Face parkas they used as a makeshift sofa. He looked beautiful even in sleep, his olive skin pale under the fluorescent hum. He was the one who had convinced the landlord to give them this incubator space for half rent. He was the one who made the coffee and told Zara she was the most brilliant woman he had ever met. Z. Adrian's voice was sleep-thickened as he sat up, rubbing his hazel eyes. He looked at the screen, then at her. "Did you find the leak in the demand curve?" "I didn't just find it, Adrian. I rerouted it," Zara said, her voice raspy. She hit the final enter key. On the screen, a chaotic swarm of red dots suddenly aligned into a perfect, pulsing golden stream. The engine is learning. It's anticipating the bottleneck before the simulation even triggers the cargo. Adrian stood up, moving into the light of the monitors. He looked at the golden stream, and for a moment, Zara saw a flash of something in his eyes, not just pride, but hunger so sharp it looked like pain. He leaned down, kissing the top of her head, his hand resting on her shoulder. The thin gold bracelet on her wrist caught the monitor's glow. "We did it," he whispered. "We're going to change the world, Z. We're going to be the names they teach in business schools." Zara leaned back into him, letting her head rest against his chest. "I don't care about the schools," Adrian. I just want it to work. I want us to be the team that solved the impossible. We are, Adrian promised, his voice dropping into that smooth, magnetic register that always made the world feel small and safe. But you know how investors are. They're old-fashioned. They need a story. They need to see a leader who can command a room while the genius works in the background. He walked over to a whiteboard covered in Zara's frantic, elegant equations. He picked up an eraser and cleared a small corner. In bold, aggressive strokes, he wrote, Vale Logistics. Zara frowned slightly. What happened tonight, Vale? Adrian turned, his smile perfectly calibrated, warm, sincere, and just a little bit condescending. It's about branding, honey. Vale is short, punchy. It sounds like a destination. Knight sounds like we're a law firm or a medieval reenactment group. Once we get the seed funding, we'll fix the legalities. But for the pitch tomorrow, let me handle the optics. I'll tell them about the engine. I'll tell them how we built it. Zara looked at the whiteboard, then at the man she loved. She was exhausted, her brain a frayed wire of algorithms and hope. She didn't see the erasure for what it was. She saw a partner willing to take the burden of the public eye so she could stay in the quiet, holy space of the creation. Okay, she whispered, turning back to the screen to run the final diagnostic. Just make sure they know it's the flow logic that matters, not the face. Adrian smiled, a look of pure, predatory triumph crossing his face as he watched her work. Don't worry, Z. I'll tell them exactly what they need to hear. In the shadows of the warehouse, the we was already dying. Zara was building an empire, but Adrian was already building the cage. The Sand Hill Road conference room was a vacuum of glass and expensive silence, smelling of sandalwood and the kind of wealth that didn't need to raise its voice. Zara sat in the lobby, her palms damp against the fabric of a borrowed blazer that was slightly too large in the shoulders. She had her laptop open, her eyes darting across the real-time telemetry of the adaptive flow engine. It was humming perfectly, a digital heartbeat waiting to be introduced to the world. Adrian stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, adjusting his silk tie and his reflection. He didn't look like a man who had been sleeping on parkas 48 hours ago. He looked like the sun. He looked like the inevitable future. You have the remote linked? Adrian asked, his voice crisp, devoid of the warehouse rasp. It's synced, Adrian. Every time you click, the engine will run a live simulation of their specific portfolio logistics. It'll show them the 14% margin recovery in real time. It's foolproof. Zara looked up, offering a tired, encouraging smile. Knocked them dead. I'll be right here if they have questions about the recursive loops. Adrian paused, his hand on the heavy mahogany door. He didn't look back. Actually, Z, the lead partner mentioned they want a streamlined session. High-level vision only. If it gets too math-heavy, they lose interest. Stay here. If they want to dive into the architecture, I'll come get you. The door clicked shut, leaving Zara alone with the hum of the air conditioning. Inside the room, the air was thick with the skepticism of three men who had seen 1,000 disruptors come and go. Adrian didn't flinch. He took his place at the head of the table, the light of the projector bathing him in the golden glow of Zara's code. He clicked the remote. The adaptive flow engine bloomed across the wall, a masterpiece of predictive choreography. 3 years ago, Adrian began, his voice a hypnotic blend of confidence and humility, I realized that the global supply chain wasn't a hardware problem. It was a consciousness problem. I began developing an engine that could perceive demand before it manifested. He clicked again. A complex recursive loop Zara had spent 6 months perfecting scroll by. I call it the Vale Logic, he said. The word I felt smooth like a polished stone. It didn't snag in his throat. It didn't feel like a lie. It felt like a correction. One of the investors, a man with white hair and eyes like flint, leaned forward. This level of predictive accuracy requires a specific type of algorithmic bias. How did you solve the latency in the feedback loop? Adrian felt a flicker of heat in his chest. The instinctual panic of a man who didn't actually know the answer. He knew the words, but he didn't know the why. He could have opened the door. He could have called Zara in. She was 20 feet away, the answer already on her tongue. But he looked at the flint-eyed man and saw the way the investor was looking at him, with awe, with a specific reverence reserved for a singular, isolated genius. If he brought Zara in now, he wasn't a visionary. He was a manager. He was a business guy, paired with a brilliant girl. The one-face narrative would shatter. I rebuilt the feedback architecture from the ground up, Adrian said, his voice steadying. I treated the latency as a data point rather than a delay. By integrating the engine's own processing speed into prediction, I eliminated the lag. It was a beautiful, hollow sentence. It was enough. The flint-eyed man nodded, scribbling a note. Brilliant. Adrian clicked the remote again, and as the engine Zara built continued to dazzle the room, he stopped thinking about we entirely. By the time the meeting ended and the investors were shaking his hand, the transition was complete. When he finally stepped back out into the lobby, Zara stood up, her face full of hopeful light. How did it go? Did they ask about the loops? Adrian didn't stop walking toward the elevators. He felt taller, broader, as if he had swallowed the sun. They loved it, Z. But we have to move fast. They're interested, but only if the brand is singular. We need to tighten the narrative. The narrative? Zara asked, hurrying to keep pace with his long, confident strides. Yeah, Adrian said, his hazel eyes fixed on the closing elevator doors. They don't want a committee, Zara. They want a leader. From now on, I handle the talk. You just keep the engine running. The headquarters of Vale Logistics was a fortress of polished chrome and floor-to-ceiling glass, a far cry from the drafty warehouse where the adaptive flow engine had first flickered to life. The humming servers were now housed in a temperature control vault, but the chilling air seemed to permeate the entire executive floor. Zara sat in the back of the boardroom, her chair pushed slightly away from a mahogany table, shadowed by the massive, framed magazine cover on the wall. It featured Adrian's face, sharp and triumphant, under the headline, The Architect of Order, How Adrian Vale Solved Chaos. There was no mention of the woman who had actually written the code. The Q3 projections are staggering, the lead director announced, tapping a digital report. Adrian, your predictive model has cut overhead by 22%. It's a miracle of engineering. Adrian leaned back, his hazel eyes crinkling with that practiced, magnetic warmth. It took a lot of late nights to get the recursive logic right, he said, his voice smooth and steady. But I knew if I could just stabilize the feedback loops, the rest would fall into place. Zara felt a sharp, cold pinch in her chest. I knew. I stabilized. She looked down at her hands, her thumb rubbing the thin gold bracelet on her wrist. She had spent 72 hours straight in the server room last month, fixing a cascading error in those very loops, while Adrian was at a gala in the Hamptons. Zara, darling, Adrian said, turning his radiant smile toward her as if noticing her for the first time. Could you grab the updated hard copies of the logistics map for the board? They're on the credenza. The room's attention shifted to her, but not with the reverence they showed Adrian. To the board, she was a supportive spouse, the technical assistant who handled the paperwork while the visionary dreamt. She was a talented wife who kept the office running, so the genius didn't have to worry about the details. I actually have a live data on my tablet, Adrian, Zara said, her voice quiet but firm. I can walk the board through the new latency adjustments I implemented last week. It explains the 22% jump more accurately than the projections. The room went silent. The lead director blinked, looking at her with a patronizing tilt of his head. Adrian's smile didn't falter, but his hazel eyes went flat and hard, the look of a man watching a subordinate overstep. We don't want to bore the board with the plumbing, Z, Adrian said, his tone dripping with a faux gentle affection that felt like a slap. Let's stay focused on the vision. Why don't you get those copies? We'll handle the high-level strategy here. Zara stood, her face burning. As she walked toward the door, she heard the director chuckle. You're a lucky man, Adrian. A wife who actually understands the jargon? Most of us have to leave the work at the office. She's a treasure, Adrian replied, and Zara could almost hear the wink in his voice. In the hallway, the silence was deafening. Every patent filed over the last year bore only one signature. Adrian Vale. Every press release credited the Vale Logic. Even the engine's interface had been rebranded, her name scrubbed from the metadata in the latest update. She wasn't just being sidelined. She was being overwritten. She walked past a glass-walled marketing office, where a team was mocking up a new campaign. The slogan read, "One vision, one mind, Vale." Zara leaned against the cool glass, her heart a slow, heavy thud. She realized then that Adrian hadn't just stolen her work. He had stolen her identity. To the world, she was a shadow. To Adrian, she was infrastructure, necessary to keep the lights on, but invisible to the guests. She looked at her reflection in glass, her deep caramel skin washed out by the fluorescent lights. She was the architect of an empire, yet she was being treated like a guest in her own house. The we was a ghost, and as she watched Adrian through the boardroom glass, laughing with the men who believed his lies, she realized the man she had married was the most successful fiction she had ever helped create. The house in the hills was a masterpiece of cold stone and curated silence, a monument to a success that felt increasingly like a crime scene. Zara sat in the dim light of Adrian's home office, the glow of his private server illuminating the sharp planes of her face. She hadn't come looking for a fight. She had come looking for a file, a legacy backup of the engine's core kernel that she needed to patch adrift in predictive logic. But the deeper she dug into the encrypted directories, the more the air seemed to vanish from the room. She found the folder labeled Project Integrity. Inside were the final patent filings for the adaptive flow engine, dated 6 months prior. Zara felt a strange, disconnected numbness spread from her fingertips as she scrolled through the documents. She looked for her name. She looked for the Knight in Night Vale. She looked for even a footnote acknowledging the recursive architecture she had bled for in that Oakland warehouse. There was nothing. The patents were registered to Adrian Vale as the sole inventor. He hadn't just omitted her name from the press releases. He had legally excised her from her own creation. He had taken the work product clauses in her employment contract, the ones he had promised were just for the VCs, and used them as a scalpel to cut her out of the empire's DNA. Every line of code, every elegant solution to the chaos of global logistics, now legally belonged to a man who couldn't explain the difference between a heuristic and a hole in the ground. The sound of the front door opening echoed through the house, the heavy, confident tread of a man who owned everything he touched. Adrian stepped into the office, his silk tie loosened, a bottle of vintage scotch in his hand. He looked at Zara, then at the screen, and for a heartbeat, his mask slipped. The magnetic charm vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating stillness. "You weren't supposed to be in here, Z," he said, his voice devoid of its usual performative warmth. "You stole them, Adrian," Zara said, her voice a low, dangerous vibration. She didn't scream. The betrayal was too deep for noise. The patents, the intellectual property. My name isn't on a single filing. You told me those papers were just formality. You told me we were partners. Adrian took a slow, deliberate sip of his drink, leaning against the doorframe. He didn't look ashamed. He looked bored. Partnership is an emotional concept, Zara. Business is a legal one. The investors needed certainty. They needed to know the genius behind the engine was the CEO they were betting on. If I put your name on those filings, the valuation drops. A husband and wife team looks like a hobby. A singular visionary looks like a blue-chip investment. I built it, Adrian. You slept on a pile of coats while I solved the demand curves that made you a billionaire. And I sold it, he countered, stepping into the light. The hazel in his eyes looked like tarnished brass. I turned your math into money. I gave you this house, the clothes, the life. You should be thanking me for protecting the brand, not digging through my files like a suspicious clerk. Zara stood up, her dark eyes pinning him with a clarity that made him flinch for the briefest of seconds. In that moment, the man she had loved dissolved. He wasn't her partner. He wasn't her husband. He was a predator who had spent 4 years grooming her to be his invisible labor. He had harvested her mind and used her heart as a leash. You didn't protect the brand, Adrian, she said, her voice turning clinical, ice cold. You stole the soul of the company because you knew you didn't have one of your own. You're not a visionary. You're a thief in a custom suit. Adrian's face darkened, the perfect smile twisting into a sneer. Go ahead. Call a lawyer. See how far. I wrote the code. Get you against a signed contract and a multi-billion-dollar board. You're a ghost, Zara, and ghosts don't own property. Zara looked at the thin gold bracelet on her wrist. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply shut the laptop with a definitive click. "You're right, Adrian," she whispered. "I am a ghost, and you're about to find out how much damage a ghost can do to a house built on lies." The conference room of the law firm of Sterling and Thorne was a frigid expanse of white marble and judgmental silence. Adrian sat on one side of the table, flanked by a phalanx of attorneys whose hourly rates could have funded a small nation. He looked immaculate, his custom suit perfectly tailored to hide the heart of the thief. Across from him, Zara sat alone. She had traded her structured blazer for a soft, oversized cashmere sweater that made her look smaller and more fragile. The defeated wife Adrian expected her to be. She kept her gaze down, her fingers trembling slightly as she toyed with the thin gold bracelet on her wrist. To Adrian, she looked like a woman who had finally realized she was outmatched. To him, this was a final cleanup of a messy startup phase. "The terms are generous, Zara," Adrian's lead counsel said, sliding a thick stack of papers across the table. "A lump sum settlement, the house in the hills, and a generous monthly stipend. In exchange, you sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement and a permanent waiver of all intellectual property claims regarding Vale Logistics." Zara let a single, shaky breath escape her lips. She didn't look at the lawyer. She looked at Adrian. "You're taking everything, Adrian. The engine is my life's work. You're leaving me with a house and a check, but no name." Adrian leaned forward, his hazel eyes flickering with a mixture of pity and impatience. "The name belongs to the brand. Z. We talked about this. You're not a businessman. You wouldn't know what to do with the equity, even if I gave it to you. Take the money. Go start a garden. Live a quiet life. You've earned a rest." Zara reached for her pen, then paused. She looked at her own lawyer, a man Adrian had vetted and assumed was a lightweight. "There's one small thing," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "A matter of security. If the company ever fails, my stipend would disappear. If the company ever undergoes a massive change, a major capital event, I need to know I'm protected." She pulled a single sheet of paper from her bag, a supplemental addendum written in dense, mind-numbing legal jargon. "It's a dormant equity clause. Section 7, subsection C. It only activates if the company secures a single outside investment of $50 million or more. It's just a safety net. Given that the company is currently bleeding cash and the VCs are spooked, it's likely worth nothing, but it would give me peace of mind." Adrian's lawyer scanned the page, his eyes glazing over as he hit the third paragraph of subordinated contingent beneficial interest and automatic trigger mechanisms. He leaned over and whispered to Adrian, "It's a garbage clause. She's looking for a win to save face. The company's valuation is stagnant, and you're not planning a Series C for years. By the time this could ever trigger, the equity would be diluted anyway. It's a vanity play." Adrian stifled a smirk. He looked at Zara, at the slight slump in her shoulders, the way she wouldn't meet his eyes. He saw a woman who was desperate for a tiny scrap of the empire she helped build, just so she could feel important one last time. "If it makes you feel better, Z," Adrian said, his voice dripping with patronizing magnanimity, "sign it. Give her the clause. I want this finished." He signed his name with a flourish, the ink bold and aggressive. Zara followed, her signature delicate and precise. She watched as the notary stamped the documents, sealing the Trojan Horse within the gates of Adrian's kingdom. As they stood to leave, Adrian reached out as if to pat her hand, but Zara pulled away, clutching her folder to her chest. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Adrian," she said softly. "I already have," he replied, adjusting his cuffs. "I have the world, Zara. What do you have?" Zara didn't answer. She walked out of the marble office and into the bright, sharp sunlight of the street. She waited until she was 3 blocks away, hidden in the back of a nondescript sedan, before she let her shoulders straighten. The defeated look vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating focus of the architect who had just wired a bomb into the foundation of her own house. She wasn't looking for a garden. She was looking for a billionaire. and she knew exactly when the clock would start ticking. 3 years had passed since Zara Knight had walked out of that marble law office as a ghost, but she hadn't spent them haunting the past. She had spent them in a quiet, high-tech sanctuary in Zurich, refining the logic that Adrian Vale thought he had mastered. She watched from across the Atlantic as Vale Logistics began to stutter. The engine was still powerful, but it was rigid. It was a masterpiece that had stopped evolving because its creator didn't understand the soul of the machine. Victor Sterling sat in a leather armchair that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, his steel-gray eyes fixed on a tablet displaying the raw architecture of the adaptive flow engine. The billionaire was known as the algorithm hunter. He didn't look at balance sheets. He looked at the DNA of the code. He had spent 6 months trying to reconcile the elegant, intuitive math of the engine with the brash, superficial ego of Adrian Vale. The math didn't lie, and right now, the math was telling him that Adrian Vale was a fraud. The demand curves in the third quadrant, Victor said, his voice a low, controlled rumble that filled the private study. They don't move like a brute force calculation. They move like a conversation. There's a specific kind of empathy in this logic, a way of predicting human behavior that feels maternal. Adrian Vale couldn't write a line of code this empathetic if his life depended on it. Zara sat opposite him, her posture perfect, her deep caramel skin glowing in the soft amber light of the study. She wore a structured charcoal blazer and the thin gold bracelet that had traveled with her from the warehouse to the shadows. She didn't offer a smile. She offered a revelation. It's called recursive intuition, Zara said, her voice steady and resonant. Adrian calls it the Vale Logic because he thinks it's a hammer, but it's actually a mirror. It doesn't just calculate where a package needs to go. It anticipates why the person at the end of the line needs it. I wrote that kernel while he was out networking. He thinks the engine runs on data. It actually runs on behavioral synchronicity. Victor looked up from the tablet, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. He didn't see a discarded wife or a technical assistant. He saw the architect. I've been tracking the lag in their latest update. The system is rejecting Adrian's attempts to optimize it. It's like an organ transplant rejecting a foreign body. The machine knows he's not the one who birthed it. He's starving it, Victor, Zara said. He's treating it like a static asset. If you don't intervene, the engine will collapse under its own weight within 18 months. He's already burning through his cash reserves trying to mask the inefficiency. Victor leaned back, a slow, deliberate smile touching his lips, the kind of smile that preceded a massacre in the markets. I've been looking for a reason to move on Vale Logistics. The board is restless, and they're desperate for a capital injection. They need $50 million to stay afloat. I'm thinking of giving them 65. Zara's heart gave a single, sharp thud against her ribs. 65 million. It was the exact threshold, the dormant clause in her divorce settlement. The Trojan Horse she had planted in Section 7, subsection C, was about to wake up. If you do that, Zara whispered, the trigger activates. I become the second largest shareholder overnight. I don't just get a seat at the table. Victor, I get the hammer. Victor stood up, his presence commanding the room. He didn't offer her a contract or a handshake. He offered her a crown. Adrian Vale wants the world to believe he's the king of order. I want to see what happens when the real architect walks back into the building and turns the lights on. Are you ready to stop being a ghost, Zara? Zara stood, the gold on her wrist catching the light. She thought of the warehouse, the sleepless nights, and the way Adrian had looked at her when he told her ghosts don't own property. I've been ready for 3 years, Victor, she said. Let's give Adrian the birthday present he deserves. The rooftop of the Sterling Grand was a shimmering cage of glass and gold, suspended high above a city that looked like a motherboard of pulsing lights. It was the kind of environment Adrian Vale thrived in, a space where perception was the only currency that mattered. He moved through the crowd with the fluid grace of a man who believed his own myth, his hand perpetually resting on the small of Camille Hart's back. Camille was a masterpiece of curated elegance, her blonde waves catching the light of the crystal chandeliers, her smile a fixed, bright ornament that signaled security and status. To the investors sipping vintage champagne, they were the ultimate power couple, the genius and his muse. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the predatory hum of a $65 million victory. Adrian had spent the last hour basking in the congratulations of men who only 3 years ago wouldn't have looked him in the eye. He felt invincible. He had the money. He had the girl. And he had successfully buried the woman who had actually made it all possible. Then the elevator chime rang, a clear, sharp note that cut through the jazz. The conversation didn't stop all at once. It rippled outward from the doors like a shockwave. Zara Knight stepped onto the terrace not as a guest, but as an inevitability. She was draped in a black silk gown that clung to her with the precision of a shadow, her natural curls styled in a sophisticated halo that commanded the room's gravity. She didn't wear diamonds. She wore a thin gold bracelet that glinted with the memory of a warehouse incubator and a look of such absolute, quiet authority that the socialites in her loud labels suddenly seemed frantic and small. Camille felt the shift before she saw the cause. She felt the muscles in Adrian's arm go rigid as stone. She watched his hazel eyes widen, the pupils constricting as if he were staring into a blinding light. "Adrian," Camille whispered, her voice tight with sudden, instinctual insecurity. "Who is that? Why is everyone looking at her?" Adrian didn't answer. He couldn't. He was watching Zara navigate the room with a terrifying, understated athletic elegance. She didn't seek out the powerful. They instinctively moved to clear a path for her. As Zara approached the center of the terrace, Camille stepped forward, her long, glossy waves bouncing as she tried to reclaim the narrative. She gripped Adrian's arm tighter, her blue eyes scanning Zara with a mixture of disdain and confusion. Camille was new image, a polished, social media-ready aesthetic that relied on lighting and angles. Zara was old money, refinement, the kind of power that didn't need to explain itself because it was built on something real. "I'm sorry," Camille said, her voice dripping with a sugary, defensive poison. "I don't believe we've met. This is a private celebration for Vale Logistics. Are you with one of the junior engineering firms?" Zara stopped. She didn't look at Camille at first. She looked at Adrian. She saw the sweat breaking on his upper lip, the way his custom suit suddenly seemed to fit him poorly. Then she turned her gaze to Camille. It was the look a grandmaster gives a pawn. "I'm Zara," she said, her voice a cool, resonant velvet that made the surrounding guests lean in. "And I'm not with a firm. I am the firm." Camille's laugh was brittle. She flashed her massive diamond engagement ring, a blinding spark of light meant to establish territory. "How charming. Adrian, darling, tell your little friend that the technical staff entrance is downstairs. We're about to have the toast." Zara's eyes dropped the ring, then back to Camille's face. A small, devastating smile touched her lips. "It's a beautiful stone, Camille. Truly. I hope the 18% equity in this company was worth the price you paid for the man wearing the mask." Before Camille could process the insult, the crowd parted again. Victor Sterling, the man of the hour, stepped forward. He didn't look at Adrian. He didn't look at the fiancée. He walked straight to Zara and, in a gesture of profound, archaic respect, took her hand and kissed it. "You're right on time, Zara," Victor said, his steel-gray eyes reflecting the city's neon. "The board is waiting. Shall we show them what real value looks like?" Adrian stood paralyzed, his empire glass beginning to moan under the weight of the truth. The gala wasn't a birthday party anymore. It was a courtroom. The rooftop atmosphere, once celebratory, had curdled into a thick, suffocating tension. Victor Sterling moved toward the mahogany podium with the slow, deliberate pace of a man about to pull the pin on a grenade. Adrian stood frozen beside Camille, his face a mask of pale olive stone, his hazel eyes darting toward the exits as if searching for a way to outrun the inevitable. He tried to force a smile, a desperate attempt to reclaim the one-phase narrative, but the spotlight felt less like an accolade and more like an interrogation lamp. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victor began, his voice a low, resonant steel that commanded the very air in the room. "Tonight was billed as a celebration of a man's vision, but Sterling Global doesn't invest in stories. We invest in the architecture of truth." A murmur rippled through the investors. Adrian's hand shook as he reached for a glass of champagne, but he missed, his fingers brushing empty air. Camille watched him, her polished glow fading into a look of sharp, crystalline panic. She could feel the tectonic plates of her social world shifting beneath her designer heels. I am officially announcing a $65 million series. See investment into Vale Logistics, Victor continued. Adrian exhaled, a momentary flash of relief washing over him. The money was real. The deal was done. He started to step forward, his hand outstretched to join Victor at the podium, ready to take the credit, ready to bury the fear. But Victor didn't move aside. He held up a hand, stopping Adrian mid-stride. However, Victor's voice dropped an octave, turning cold. This investment was predicated on a specific legal audit. It appears that in the haste of a certain divorce settlement 4 years ago, a dormant equity clause was established. Section 7, subsection C, a Trojan Horse, that triggers the moment the company crosses the $50 million threshold in outside capital. The room went deathly silent. The only sound was the wind whistling through the glass railings. As of 3 minutes ago, Victor said, checking his watch with a terrifying indifference, the wire transfer cleared. The clause is active. 18% of Adrian Vale's personal equity has been automatically reallocated to the original architect of the adaptive flow engine. Victor turned away from the crowd and looked directly at Zara. He didn't just invite her forward. He ceded the floor to her as she walked toward the podium, the thin gold bracelet on her wrist catching the strobe lights of the press. Victor leaned down and pressed a slow, unmistakable kiss to her cheek, a public seal of alliance that acted as a death warrant for Adrian's reputation. Meet your new majority individual shareholder, Victor announced. Zara Knight. The giant LED screens behind the podium, which had been cycling through photos of Adrian's face, suddenly flickered and changed. They didn't show marketing headshots. They showed raw, time-stamped lines of code from 5 years ago. They showed the original development logs from a warehouse in Oakland, every line of logic tagged with a digital signature, Z. Knight. The Vale Logic was exposed in an instant for what it was, a stolen masterpiece with a true artist's name written in the margins. Adrian felt the world tilt. He looked at the screen, then at the board members who were already turning their backs on him to whisper to one another. He looked at Camille, whose grip on his arm had gone slack, her blue eyes wide with the realization that she had tethered herself to a sinking ship. Zara reached the podium. She didn't look at the cameras. She looked straight at Adrian, her dark eyes sharp and observant, stripping away the last of his carefully curated layers. You told me once that investors bet on one face, Adrian, Zara said, her voice amplified by the microphone, echoing across the rooftop like a gavel. You were right, but you forgot that a face is nothing without the mind behind it. The Series C is closed. The engine is mine. And your time as an architect is over. By midnight, the Oracle of Logistics was a ghost, and the woman he tried to erase was the only person the world wanted to see. The aftermath of the announcement was a funeral disguised as a cocktail hour. The glittering rooftop, which had been the site of Adrian's coronation, now felt like a cage of cold light and exposed lies. Zara sat at the head of the mahogany conference table in the Sterling Grand's private executive suite, a space that smelled of cedar and the absolute finality of a closed deal. Victor Sterling stood by the window, a silent, powerful sentinel watching the city, while the board of directors sat in stunned, rigid rows, their loyalties having shifted with the speed of a high-frequency trade. Adrian sat at the far end of the table, his custom Italian suit now looking like a costume he had outgrown. His hazel eyes were bloodshot, the magnetic charm replaced by a hollow, frantic desperation. Camille was gone. She had vanished the moment the legal team confirmed that Adrian's personal net worth had effectively been halved in a single heartbeat. She didn't do technical debt, and Adrian was now the greatest liability in the room. The bylaws are clear, the lead director stated, his voice devoid of the warmth he had shown Adrian only hours before. With the 18% transfer, combined with Victor Sterling's voting bloc, Zara Knight holds a controlling interest. Adrian, your position as CEO is untenable in its current form. Adrian's hands shook as he gripped the edge of the table. I built the brand. I am the face of this company. You can't just move me to a basement office. Zara leaned forward, the soft glow of the table's surface reflecting in her dark, observant eyes. She didn't look at him with hatred. She looked at him with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a failed experiment. The thin gold bracelet on her wrist clinked softly against the wood, a small, sharp sound that seemed to echo in the silence. "You aren't going to a basement, Adrian," Zara said, her voice a calm, velvet hammer. "You're staying right where you are. For now, the market needs stability, and the world still recognizes your face. You will remain as the figurehead CEO. You will do the interviews, you will wear the suits, and you will read the scripts I write for you. But you will no longer have access to the core architecture. You will not file a single patent. You are no longer the architect. You are the spokesman." The humiliation was total. Adrian looked at the board, searching for a single ally, but every face was turned toward Zara. He had spent years telling her that investors only bet on one face. He just never imagined he would become a mask for hers. He was now an employee in the empire he had tried to steal, a ghost haunting his own C-suite. "I'll have my assistant send over the new operational protocols by morning," Zara continued, standing up with a quiet authority that commanded the room to rise with her. "Welcome to the new Vale Logistics, Adrian. I suggest you start practicing your lines." She didn't wait for his response. She turned and walked toward the door, where Victor was already waiting. As they stepped out onto the private balcony, the cool night air of the city rushed to meet them, smelling of ozone and freedom. The weight of 4 years of erasure, of being a ghost in her own life, finally lifted. Victor looked at her, his steel-gray eyes unreadable but for a faint glimmer of genuine respect. "You didn't destroy him," he noted, his voice a low rumble. "Destruction is messy, Victor," Zara said, looking out at the grid of the city, the adaptive flow engine's logic pulsing in every light she saw. "Restoration is much cleaner. I didn't want him gone. I wanted him to see me win." Victor offered his arm, a gesture that was no longer about a public play, but a private partnership. "The car is downstairs. There's a new project in Singapore that's having trouble with its predictive curves. They say it's impossible to solve." Zara smiled, a real, radiant smile that reached her eyes for the first time in years. She took his arm, the gold on her wrist catching the moonlight as they walked toward a future that was finally, legally, and brilliantly her own. "Impossible," Zara said, "is just an algorithm I haven't written yet."